Techniques of Fiberglass Moulding with Chris Conroy. Another instructional video from Concept Television Productions showing the techniques of professional fiberglass moulding.
It occurred to me during the week that for the last 7 years or so, I've been talking about fiberglass and various boat building materials without ever explaining or describing exactly what those materials do and how you use them. Now, the case in point today is fiberglass, and it's a remarkably useful and versatile material. It's a material that's used for all kinds of industrial processes, right from small electronic component potting up to major components for spacecraft. But it's a material that's also well within the scope of everybody on a home handyman basis to use to great effect. So we've decided to commence a series this week and show you exactly, step by step, how you use fiberglass. Now, we're going to start with the basic fiberglass laminate, in other words, the one that you would use for making whatever you need to make around the house, and the one that's used for building fiberglass boats. And then over the next couple of months, we'll expand that into making of your plugs, your patterns and your moulds, and also some of the more exotic processes using foam and balsa sandwich and some of the exotic reinforcing materials. But we start off this week with the basic fiberglass process. Now, one of the major advantages of fiberglass is that it requires very few tools. In fact, the tools that you see in that section on the table there are the only hand tools that you'll require to execute a basic fiberglass laminate. We have a scale, which is graduated in this case in imperial and metric, a couple of brushes, and you can get brushes of varying sizes, a couple of compressor rollers, a trimming knife, and a pair of scissors. Now, fundamentally, that is absolutely all you'll need to make a fiberglass moulding, even a relatively complex one. To go through the materials that you require in sequence, we start off on this end of the table with the materials that we use to prepare the mould for the moulding. We have release waxes, and there are a couple of different types there. You'll notice that this is the old Johnson's floor polish. When you're buying that, by the way, make sure that you buy a non-silicon floor polish, and this is a very sophisticated release wax which is used by industry and in the production of fiberglass boats. Now, this polish is used in conjunction with a liquid release agent. This polish is used by itself. So there is a difference between those two, but people who work at home often use the more sophisticated single release system. Now, we'll move over to this end of the table. Here we have the other materials. Now, they comprise the reinforcing materials, which are basically woven roving that you see there, and that's available in several different weights, and a random fibre chopped strand mat. Now, that again is available in several weights, and both of those materials are made from this basis. This is fiberglass continuous roving. Now, you can see the relationship particularly between the woven roving and that single toe of roving there. And if you imagine this cut up into lengths about that long and sprayed onto a table, sprayed with a binder which holds them together, you can imagine how that is manufactured into chopped strand mat. Now, the basic difference between those materials is that their strength lies in two different areas. This is what is called a unidirectional reinforcing material. In other words, its strength is either in that direction or that direction. And this is a multi-directional reinforcing material where the strands lie in all directions, so it gives you an even stress all over the surface. Now, those two materials are almost invariably used in conjunction, in combination, in most fiberglass laminates, and I'll tell you why that is so a little later. Here is the resin, and we'll see that used a little later. We'll pour it out of the can later. This is a gel coat. Now, again, when we're applying the gel coat in just a moment, I'll tell you about gel coat and tell you why it's there and why it's used. And here are the other tools, stirring sticks, which can be paddle pop sticks or any piece of timber, providing it has a sharp square edge, and I'll tell you why in a moment, and mixing pots for the resin and for the gel coat. Now, we're going to use a model boat hull mould to show you these techniques. In fact, it's a Seafarer VC scale model. And it really is relevant because it's a scaled down version of a full-size boat hull mould, exactly the same as the ones that are used in the fiberglass factories, but it has a couple of little difficult contours in it which require a slightly different application, so effectively that expands the technique. The first step is to put the release system in the mould. Now, in this particular case, it's a two-part release system comprising a non-silicon floor wax which you spread liberally over the inside of the mould, making sure that you don't miss any part of it whatsoever. Just make sure that your wax is smeared evenly over there, and a piece of old rag is ideal for that purpose. Be quite liberal with the wax, just to make absolutely certain, and make sure you get the tip of your finger or your fingernail down into the rag to push the wax down into those little tight contours. As with any application of fiberglass, as with any stage during the building of a fiberglass boat, absolute thoroughness is essential, and if you exercise that, in fact if you're overcautious, you'll find that you won't have any problems whatsoever. Now immediately the wax goes in, and most importantly before it dries, you polish it straight back out again. The wax is not necessarily designed to impregnate the surface, it's only really there to alter the surface tension of the mould to prepare it for the application of the liquid release agent. Now the only way to get it out thoroughly and to make sure that it is all 100% removed is to use two rags. So you use one rag first and then the second rag to complete the polishing process. And by the way, cheesecloth is ideal for this, but I've found over the years that a perfect material is an old t-shirt, as I'm using in this case. That wool is no good, by the way. Wool has never really been any good at all as a polishing fabric, but a cotton-based fabric such as an old t-shirt is absolutely perfect. Now, as you can see, there's a gloss is coming up inside that mould, indicating that I've removed all of the wax that I first applied. Now, normally, if the mould hasn't been used before, you wax it at least twice and preferably 3 times. Again, a belt and braces policy. You make sure that each operation is done properly, in this case by repeating it, but this mould has been used before, so that application of wax will prepare the surface for the liquid release agent. Now this is a polyvinyl alcohol, which is a vinyl in suspension in alcohol, and if you look closely there, it's slightly coloured, it has a pink tinge to it, so that it gives you some indication of the coverage that you've achieved. So you quite liberally put the PVA onto the rag and then use the rag to spread it evenly over the inside of the mould, and it really does spread very easily. It does quite a good job of covering the entire surface. Now the alternative for wiping the PVA in with the rag is to spray it with a spray gun. Again, it's probably beyond the scope of a lot of people who would be doing this on an amateur basis. Certainly not worth buying a spray gun specifically for that purpose when the rag does it perfectly. The only thing about it is you have to make sure that you cover 100% of the surface first time up, because you can't go back over it. Once that PVA dries, it's not possible to use the rag to wipe a second layer over. So as you can see, I'm being very thorough, making sure that my fingernail pushes that rag and therefore the release agent down into all of the little contours and the tight sections in the mould there. Now that's pretty well ready for the next step, which is the application of the gel coat. But you must make absolutely certain that that PVA is completely dry before you apply the gel coat. Now it's alcohol based, so the alcohol flashes off quite rapidly. It takes 10, maybe 15 minutes to dry, so we'll come back as soon as that happens. Right, 15 minutes has gone by, and I've checked that PVA by touching it very gently with my fingertip, particularly down in the tight corners, and I've established that it's dry. So it's now time to put the gel coat on, and this is where we get into the true fiberglass techniques. This is white gel coat supplied by Daystar Proprietary Limited. Gel coat is available in a vast variety of colours, and it's possible to get almost any colour you can think of, and to match the colour of any existing fiberglass article. I'm using here a wax cup, but you can use a wide variety of containers, providing they're not soluble in styrene, and some of the plastic bottles are, so be careful of that. I pour the gel coat in there, and that's a pretty basic way of doing it, making sure that I don't go any closer than about 25 millimetres from the top, and I put it on the scale. Now the scale shows 250 grams, and I want 1% of catalyst in that resin to give me an average cure time. Now you can quite easily transpose grams for millilitres, and this catalyst bottle has graduations on the side in 5 millimetre increments starting at 5 millimetres. Now with 250 grams of gel coat in there, I'll want 2.5 millimetres of catalyst. Now this catalyst is in a special decanting bottle. What I do is squeeze the bottle, the catalyst moves up the tube, and if I stop just below the 5 mil graduation, I know that I have approximately 2.5 mils of catalyst. Now the nice thing about this material is that it's not critical in its proportions. Providing you have a minimum amount of catalyst in there, you will get a cure. So it doesn't matter whether I have 2 mils or 3 mils in there when I'm aiming for about 2.5. Now before we mix it, a few words about catalyst. It's methyl ethyl ketone peroxide. It's an organic peroxide, which means that it has drastic effects if it touches tissue, particularly eye tissue. Now if you get that in your eye in its undiluted form, it will cause damage which becomes cumulative. In fact, I've known people who've had catalyst in their eyes when they were 19 or 20, irrigated it out fairly quickly, and had no idea that they had continuing troubles until they were 35 or 40 when eye problems came along. So you must treat it with great respect, and that's one of the reasons that we use this special decanting bottle. It avoids having to pour catalyst into measuring cylinders and makes it an awful lot easier to use. Now all of these materials have to be treated with great respect, but if you take minimal precautions, you'll find that you won't have any trouble. Now I pour the catalyst into the resin, and then I commence stirring. Now gel coat has some interesting properties. If I just lift it on the stick there, you'll notice that it pours, but with still quite a large volume on the stick, it stops pouring. Now that means that it has a property called thixotropy. That's a great word, but it means the ability of a liquid to hang up on a vertical surface regardless of its viscosity, and you'll see in just a moment why gel coat has to be thixotropic. Now that means that stirring it, just agitating it like that, is not enough to distribute that catalyst evenly through the full volume of gel coat. So without beating it, and if you beat it you aerate it, and that's undesirable, you simply stir it around. You use your sharp cornered stick, and I mentioned earlier that the stick had to have a sharp corner on the bottom. You use it as a scraper to scrape around the inside of the container, scrape the bottom, scrape the little angle down in the bottom of the container there, and just make sure that your catalyst is completely distributed right through the gel coat. Another case in point for being thorough with everything you do. I often see people in the fiberglass industry use their brush to stir the catalyst into their resin, and that is not the way to go, because the brush will have uncatalyzed resin trapped in the hairs which will not be catalyzed. So that really isn't the way to go. Now for that small container, for a fairly large stirring stick, I reckon that I've got it pretty well evenly distributed. So we can stop stirring now, scrape the stick off and stir that back into the cup, because there was uncatalyzed gel coat clinging to the stick. Just scrape it back into the cup. Put the stirring stick in another container, and by the way, it's essential to work clean with fiberglass. You must have a container for everything and somewhere to put everything that you use. Now I dip the brush into that gel coat and really load it up. You can see that I've spread the bristles of the brush by bobbing it up and down into the cup, and then I use the brush not to paint it on, but to spread it onto the inside of the mould. I make sure that I have a liberal coating of gel coat on the inside of the mould. In fact, the manufacturers tell us that you should have about 15 thou, again a mix of imperial and metric, but you should have about 15,000ths of an inch of gel coat all over the surface of that mould in order for the gel coat to do its job. Now, which brings me to the point of why you use gel coat, and you use it for several reasons. Firstly, and obviously, it gives you the colour on the outside of your moulding. In fact, fiberglass is one of the few manufacturing processes where your final finish, where the final outside layer is applied before the article itself is actually made. So effectively, fiberglass articles are made inside out. Now you'll notice that I'm continuing to load that brush up and continuing to spread the gel coat all over the inside of the mould. Now at this stage, because I've just stirred it, it will flow quite happily and it's quite easy to brush. But a couple of minutes after I've finished applying it to the inside of the mould, it will what they call set up. It's not the curing process, but the thixotropy has been sheared by stirring it, and once it's still again on the inside of the mould, it tends to lock up and be difficult to brush. So you have to make sure that you are fairly rapid and accurate in the distribution of the gel coat. Now you'll notice I'm continuing to load that brush up with gel coat and continuing to spread it over the inside surface. The second reason that we use gel coat is to isolate the laminate itself, which contains the glass fibre, from the environment in which it lives. Gel coat is a completely homogeneous layer. It's impervious to penetration by water. It resists breakdown by ultraviolet for a fairly extended period of time. So effectively, it's a completely impervious layer over the outside of the main fiberglass moulding. And of course, the fiberglass itself is what gives the article its strength and rigidity. The gel coat, because it's not reinforced, is really quite brittle. Now it takes about 2.5 to 3 hours under normal circumstances for that gel coat to cure, and you shouldn't lay up your fiberglass over the back of it until it is completely cured. So we'll give it 2.5 hours and then we'll come back and we'll put the fiberglass in. Before we get into actually laying up the hull, there are a couple of things I want to tell you about the maintenance of your tools, particularly your brushes. Now this brush here is full of gel coat, and it's full of catalysed gel coat. Now if we don't wash it properly and thoroughly, that gel coat will cure in there and ruin the brush. Now if I just drop that into the acetone, and I'll talk about acetone in a second, without doing anything, the acetone isn't strong enough to dissolve all of the gel coat in the brush, and it'll cure and we'll lose it. So whenever you're putting a brush into the acetone, your washing solvent, you always pop it up and down like that and make sure that you've cleaned all of the resin or gel coat out of the bristles. Now you leave it in the acetone there. Now acetone is a fairly common material, but it has a couple of properties which you should know about and which are most important. Firstly, it evaporates very, very quickly and it's expensive. So make sure that you have a couple of cans with acetone in them with caps on them so that you can minimise the acetone loss. Secondly, when you've washed your brushes in a can of acetone, it leaves a residue in the acetone of the resin or the gel coat, and that makes it very sticky. So you wash your hands in it and it will leave a layer of sticky resin on your hands, making them most uncomfortable. So you have a second can full of relatively clean acetone, and I don't know if I can show it to you there. I'll try to. It's a clear liquid which looks very much like water. You have a second can of clean acetone there in which you wash your hands, and it's a good idea, if you can, to keep a little bit of rag in it so that that facilitates washing your hands. Now again, after you've washed your hands in that a few times, it'll get a little bit of resin in it and they'll be sticky. So I always have a shaker of talc, in this case raw talc, and I just shake some onto my hands, dust them over, and it takes the stickiness away and makes them far more comfortable to use. Now I haven't struck many people who are allergic to either the styrene in the resin or gel coat or the acetone, but some people do have a reaction, and it can cause nasty skin ailments there. So if you do have any problems with contact with chemicals with your skin, wear rubber gloves whilst ever you're handling these materials. Now the other aspect of acetone is that because it evaporates quickly, that means that it's volatile. It really is highly inflammable and also explosive. So one of the other reasons for keeping it capped and for being very careful with naked flame around the workshop is to minimise the chance of explosion or fire. Now a bit of caution will eliminate any problems. In fact, I worked in this material for over 20 years in Sydney and didn't even ever look like having a problem with fire. So it's not necessarily dangerous unless you are careless and you mistreat it. Now let's get busy and lay the hull up. The very first step in doing any laminate is to make sure that you have all of the tools and equipment available to hand that you're going to need for the job. Firstly, we make sure that the brush is ready. Now that brush has been soaking in the acetone. You'll notice that the ferrule has become full of acetone. So we shake the acetone out and we make sure that all of the acetone is out of the brush. Now as I said earlier, it evaporates very quickly, so just shaking it out like that and putting it aside suffices. Now we'll just get the acetone out of the way there. The resin is polyester resin. It is a thermoset resin, which means that it cures by heat. And this applies to the gel coat as well. The heat is generated by adding a catalyst or a hardener to the resin, which initiates a chemical reaction which causes, by the generation of heat, all of the molecules in that resin to cross-link and convert it from a liquid to a solid. Now that fundamentally is what happens. The catalyst is exactly that. It initiates a reaction which is taken over by the resin itself. So the amount of catalyst that you can use varies widely according to the conditions. If you have any catalyst in there at all, down to a very, very low percentage, the reaction will be started and the cure will be affected. Now, if you have only a very small amount of catalyst, that will take a long time. If you have a large amount of catalyst, it will take a very short time, and in the process generate so much heat that it's possible for this to fume and crack and melt the pot that it's sitting in. So somewhere in between we have to strike a compromise. And the amount of catalyst that we use is governed by the conditions on a given day. But for normal room temperature, which is pretty well universal, we use 1%, which is 10 mils to the kilo. Now I'll just have a look at how much we have there. We have exactly a kilo, which is not a bad guess. So I put 10 mils into that, which is there, pour it into the resin, and as we saw with the gel coat, it's essential that it be thoroughly stirred and distributed through the resin. Now, I'll see if I can show you the resin there. You can see that it is a blue colour. That resin is designed so that the peroxide in the catalyst bleaches that blue dye out and gives you an indication as to whether you have catalyst in the resin or not. Now, not only does it give you that indication, but with experience you can tell by looking at the colour of the resin in the pot just how advanced the cure is. Now, that is a great asset when you're laying up a fiberglass article, to be able to tell just how long it's going to be before the resin finally gels off. Now, I'm stirring that, agitating it quite well, but I'm not beating it because I want to eliminate the amount of air that I actually introduce into the resin by stirring it, making sure that I scrape the sides and the bottom of the container with the stirring stick, and just making sure that that really is stirred properly. In fact, a stirring stick of that size and shape is ideal. You'll notice that it's fairly flat and thin. It's like a paddle, and it really does agitate the resin around there. Now, I'm satisfied that I've got that well enough stirred, so I'll just put all that aside, including the scales, and we end up with our brushes and our compressor roller. I'll move the mould back around here. The idea is to take your fiberglass reinforcing material, which looks like that, and impregnate it with the resin. Now, that's relatively easy to do. You could put the fiberglass in and just slap great brushfuls of resin all over it and you would impregnate it, but the resin and the glass work together in a fairly definite ratio to give you the maximum strength in the laminate, and that ratio is around about 2 to 1 by weight. So in order to achieve that ratio, or get as close as you possibly can to it, it's necessary to use a couple of special techniques. Now, I'll just show you how that's done. Firstly, you lay quite a substantial amount of resin, a generous amount of resin, into the mould. You really get that resin and brush it into the mould so that it's covering 100% of the surface. Now, obviously, in this model boat mould, I can look at laying up virtually the entire hull in one go, but with a larger boat, you would break it up into sections. You might say take that length from the transom along the top side and look at that as being the section that you were laying up with one particular batch of resin and one particular amount of glass. Now, I've pre-cut this glass with the scissors so that it approximately fits into that mould in the shape that I want it. Now, I find that it is folding up here, so I'll just tear the chop strand mat in that corner so that it settles down. Make sure that the glass is settled down properly into all areas of the mould. If I see that it's folding up, that it's bubbling there, I can just quite happily tear it and it will settle down into the mould. The next step is probably the most difficult of all techniques for the neophyte fiberglass worker to master, and that is the stippling technique. I load the brush up with resin and I apply it in a stippling action to the glass. Now, that actually squeezes the resin out of the brush into the glass in a controlled fashion, and by using that technique rather than brushing it, I can govern the amount of resin that I apply to any particular area of the boat, and that is the major factor in making sure that you control your resin to glass ratio. Now, that glass is held in its matte form by a binder which is soluble in the resin, so all of those strands have been sprayed onto a continuous table, and they've been sprayed with this binder, which dissolves pretty well on contact with the resin. So after I've stippled the resin into the glass and it's lost its clear look, I'm pretty well certain that the binder has dissolved. It is then time for the next and most important step. Using the compressor roller, which with this larger compressor roller you can see what it is. It's a series effectively of flat washers which are on a roller, on an axle there. I have to use the small one on this boat. But that presses the strands of fiberglass down against the back of the gel coat, and in the process squeezes all the resin and the air up through it and consolidates the laminate. Now it's most important that all air bubbles be completely removed from the fiberglass laminate. So you go over it very thoroughly with the roller. If you look carefully, you can see the bubbles as little silver bubbles in the glass there, mainly because, of course, the resin is clear. So if you look carefully and with a little bit of experience, you can actually see the air bubbles down in the glass. Now, in this chine contour here, down here, we have a problem because that's a fairly tight little corner. It's difficult for the glass to get down into it. So in order to help it, we run our finger along and press it down. Check over the back of the laminate. It all looks pretty good. And we finally tidy that up with a fairly dry brush. Again, the brush only has to be wet with resin so that it is effectively lubricated as it touches the mould surface there, rather than applying more resin. So we just use the brush for a final tidy up. The next step is to apply the woven roving. Now, this is not really necessary in a small boat of this size, but it's a material that's used universally in the production of fiberglass boats. So I'll put it in to show you just exactly how it's applied. Normally it would be rolled up in a large boat. It would be rolled up, put on the edge of the gunnel and just rolled down into the mould there so that it falls into position. You then very carefully wet it out without using anywhere near as much resin as you used for that first layer of chopped strand mat, because remember, there is a fair amount of resin in that mat which will be worked up through the woven roving as you roll it. Now that, again, you are aiming to minimise the amount of resin that you put into the mould, along with making sure, of course, that it's properly wet out. Now with woven roving, because it is a fairly tight weave, it's possible to brush the resin in rather than having to stick completely with that stippling action. But the stippling action not only is used to govern the amount of resin you put in, but it's also used to control and move the glass around. It's possible to exercise quite a high degree of control over that glass even after it's wet out, once you have learnt the basic brush technique, the stippling technique. Now those strands sticking out there are not really important because the next layer will go over and cover them. Again, we use the compressor roller to work the woven roving and to press the roving down into the mat underneath it and help the resin to squeeze through. Now it takes the roving a little longer to wet out than it does the mat, because obviously it's quite a thick material and those straight strands of roving, such as that one there, are really quite thick. It takes a little more work with the compressor roller and with the brush to work the resin up through it. But your indication that it's fully wet comes when all of the white colour disappears and it goes completely clear. Again, bubbles are extremely easy to see because they show up with a silvery colour on them down inside the moulding there. Now, once your woven roving is in, it's time to put another layer of mat over the top. As you go through the laminating process, it becomes easier and easier to wet it out because obviously you have resin underneath that you can work up through. In fact, that really is the secret of fiberglass laminating, the fact that rather than trying to put the resin down through the mat from the outside, or the roving for that matter, it's far better to work it up from underneath and supplement the wet out by applying resin to the outside surface. That way you are actually moving the resin up through the laminate in the same direction as you are trying to move the air up through the laminate. And as the resin comes up through, obviously it'll carry the air with it and make the job a whole lot easier. Now, as you can see, with certain areas such as this one here, you can see where the resin has gone into the mat and where the mat is still white there. Now, if that were the first layer, I would have to work it like that with a brush and make sure I had resin in it. But because it's the third layer and we have laminate underneath, I can rely on the compressor roller to assist me to wet those areas out. And as I go over it with that roller, you can see the way in which the resin's being squeezed up into the mat and the mat is being completely wet out. Now, it takes a minute or so for the white colour to disappear because of the length of time that it takes for the binder to be dissolved by the styrene in the resin. But fundamentally, that is the way you do it. Now, if you take care if you make sure that you have plenty of curing time on your resin, and that's easily determined by reading the data sheet that comes with the resin, and there are plenty of data sheets available from Daystar, and I know that for a fact because I wrote them all about 15 years ago. So all of the information that you need, not only for these basic techniques in writing, and particularly proportions of resin and catalyst, etc., but also for the number of layers that you put on for certain various sizes of mouldings of boats and that sort of thing. All of that information is readily available. Now, we'll let that cure, and I'll put the rest of the layers in the boat, and then we'll go through some of the techniques of finishing off the boat, the application of the timber, etc. But before I go, one of the reasons, one of the confining factors with using a mould like this is the fact that because of its small size, we can't use some of the equipment that's used on the bigger boats. Now, the application of the resin on larger laminates is taken over by that specially made fiberglass paint roller, and it is exactly a paint rolling technique. You have your normal roller tray with your catalysed resin in it, you dip your roller in it and you roll it down into the mould. Now, in some cases, of course, with a fairly large boat, it's necessary to put a length of dowel in the handle so that you can reach it, and also the handle of this roller is set up so that it will accept a length of dowel in the same way, so you don't necessarily have to be able to actually bend over and reach the area you're working on. You can extend the tools so that you can reach all of these areas. Now, I'll finish this off and we'll come back and show you how to install the timber. And now around about an hour and a half has gone by and the curing process is well underway. In fact, the laminate has now assumed a sticky, rubbery feel, and it's now time to trim it. We use a good solid sharp trimming knife there and actually shear the laminate off against the top edge of the mould. Now, the alternative to this is to allow it to cure fully out and have to either sand it or cut it with a saw to get that flash off. Now, neither of those measures is desirable because all they do is generate dust, and fiberglass dust is itchy powder. So whatever you do, make sure that you keep your eye on the finished job and catch it at exactly the right time to trim it. Now comes the time when we install the timber inserts, the core in the transom, and also the stringers along the bottom of the boat. Now, we'll need a drop of resin. Heavy core plywood is used for the transom, generally 3/4 of an inch or 20 to 25 millimetres thick. And the stringers are generally made out of softwood. Now, all of those elements will be completely encapsulated in fiberglass, but first of all, we have to bond them into the boat itself. Now, I've prepared a piece of timber there for the transom, and I've gotten a piece of fiberglass ready to bond it in. I'm just mixing some resin there. We'll use a smaller brush the resin over the inside surface. Again, exactly the same technique as we started off with, but the technique varies a little when we're applying the glass and the resin. We want a good, solid, thick, sloppy, if you like, layer of glass and resin in there, so that when we clamp the timber in, it really squeezes down in, and the resin actually squeezes into the grain of the timber and adheres it well and truly to the laminate underneath. So we just brush plenty of resin in there, apply the sawn plywood transom, and apply pressure using these G-clamps. Now, this is exactly the technique used for a larger boat. It doesn't vary in any way, except of course for the size of the clamps, for the size of the boat. So that's really pulled the timber down into the laminate that I've just applied. Generally, with a full-size boat, the plywood has a sanded surface. If it does have a sanded surface, make sure that you rough it up with a disc sander before you apply it. Now, I'm just brushing some resin in there. Again, pretty well similar to the technique used for a larger boat. I've prepared the timber stringers, the longitudinal stringers, which I just drop in there and set them in the resin that I've put in. Now, that one probably will be a bit reluctant. No, it'll stay there. So we'll put a bit of resin around to stick them in. They have to be held solidly so that we can continue the bonding process. Now, one thing about this, fiberglass will not go over a tight edge, so you must round the top corners of the stringers before you actually apply them in the boat. We'll come back when that's cured and put the rest of the laminate over. Right, well, we've allowed the laminate holding the stringers and the transom into the boat to gel, and I've applied the laminate over the top of the stringers here. Now, the interesting thing about that is that you're applying another layer to the inside of the boat when you do that. So that means that you allow for that when you're calculating the total number of layers that you put in the boat. Now, I'll just remove the clamps that hold the transom core in, and of course that is well and truly adhered to that fiberglass that we laid down underneath, and we put our final layers of glass over the top of it. Now, in this case I'll just put one in, but again, the transom is the most highly stressed part of the boat, particularly of course if it's a power boat, so you could use up to another 3 or perhaps 4 layers over the top of that in a full-size boat. Now, you'll notice that I tore some slits in that piece of glass so that it fitted down over the stringers. One of the most important things to remember when you're building any fiberglass article, and remember, the techniques that I've shown you here today on the boat are applicable to anything that you build out of fiberglass, the only difference being the scale, the length of time, and the number of layers that you put in. But the basic techniques that we've covered here today are applicable to anything that you make out of fiberglass. But when you're doing it, make sure that you allow plenty of overlap areas so that the sides overlap the transom overlaps the sides, and particularly down the keel and chines. Now that means that you effectively get double thickness and therefore double strength in all of those areas, which is really a great asset and is part of the overall structural setup of whatever article you're making. Now, you must work with maximum sizes of sheets of material. For instance, if this were a full-size boat, I'd be looking at going from the keel to the chine by 1 metre wide, which is the width of the roll of mat that you buy. Overlap it by around about or 75 millimetres and go another metre up the length of the boat, and so on, so that you're working with sizes of materials and sizes of sheet that are easy to handle as far as the glass itself is concerned, and are also easy to handle as far as the amount of resin that you mix, which really should not be more than about 2 kilos at a time, and of course your resins and your tools. Now we'll let that sit in the mould for 24 hours now. There are stresses set up during the curing process. The exotherm, the heat generated by the laminate as it cures, must be allowed to dissipate completely, the laminate cool right back down to normal room temperature, and sit there for quite a few hours before you attempt to release it. So we'll come back and release it as soon as that happens. Well, we've gone through the entire process. We've waited 24 hours for the laminate inside the whole mould to cure there, and now it's time to release it. And this is where a lot of boats are damaged, or a lot of mouldings are damaged. It's necessary to be very, very careful in the release process. Now I'm using a chisel here to pry the top edge of the moulding away from the mould. Obviously you have to be very careful. Now that popped extremely easily. In fact, it's released now. But if it is a little reluctant, and you'll generally find that with a larger moulding, you may have to exert pressure in certain areas, and you do that by making up wedges such as that little wooden one there. Pry the top away and drive the wedges down. Now you'll find that as you go you can hear it cracking and popping as it releases from the mould. You may have to tap them with a hammer, but whatever you do, don't touch any other area of the boat or the mould with the hammer, and if you're patient and careful, you'll find that they will always pop out, providing of course that you've followed the instructions at the beginning of all of this and put the right sort of release system in. So we'll assume that we've done all that we've popped it out, it is now released, and it's come up above the mould surface. It really is just a matter then of lifting it out like that, and there is the finished product. Now generally you'll find most manufacturers will leave it at that, but some manufacturers from the chine up will put a buff over it with machine compound just to lift the final gloss. But if the mould has been built properly and prepared properly, the boat comes out with its final finish already on the surface, and it's not difficult with modern materials and modern gel coats to maintain that sort of standard. Now we've shown you the basic process, we've shown you a few little wrinkles and a few little tricks of the trade that I've learned over 20 or so years of doing this sort of thing. But there are a lot of other aspects of using fiberglass in a home environment which really are truly interesting. So over the coming months we're going to look at those on a one at a time basis. Things such as foam sandwich techniques, the things such as putting in a multicoloured gel coat into a mould. That about finishes our fiberglass moulding.